Hi and welcome back to this part 2 of May's book haul, and we'll just start with The Brothers Lionheart by Astrid Lindgren, first published in 1973. Astrid Lindgren was a Swedish author and maybe most known for her books about Pippi Longstocking. I would say that she's the biggest one of them all when it comes to children's literature in Scandinavia, and she has so many famous books for us growing up in this part of the world. This is one of the famous ones, and if you read any books at all when you grew up, this might be one of the ones you read. The story is about two brothers, the youngest one around 7 years old and the oldest one around 12 years old. I might be wrong, but something along those lines. The youngest one has a disease that's going to kill him, and to comfort the youngest brother, the oldest one reads him stories about this place called Nanginjala. And this is the place where you get to when you die. One day a fire occurs in their home and they live some floors above the ground. And to save the youngest boy, the oldest one takes him on the back and the eldest one takes the fall and dies. And when the youngest one also dies from disease, they meet up in Nanginjala. In this place there are two valleys and one of them is under evil occupation, and so they set out to save the people in the valley. And that's basically the story. Of course, the first thing that strikes me when reading this is how brutal it is. It does not feel like reading a children's novel, especially not in the start. I was only a few pages in and they both die, and it's hard to read, I must admit. Also, there are some simple but very powerful drawings in this book that I really enjoyed. So it sort of feels like there's a bit of social realism in it. Also, there's a point being made about there being no money in the valley, and it feels kind of socialist, I might say. Very Scandinavian. This next thing I'm going to say, I don't know if I'm saying because I haven't read too many children's novels or if it's just a feeling, but this book feels more brutal than I could imagine someone writing about today, in a children's novel at least. But I will read more children's novels and see if this is a thing. I must say that what makes this story great is the youngest one's inner dialogue towards his brother. He talks about his older brother being so great whilst doing great things himself. And he just idolizes his older brother so much, and it's just so heartwarming and beautiful. And the reason why I'll probably read this book once more at some point. It was really a joy to read this book, and not the last book I'll read from Astrid Lindgren. Then over to another Swede that has probably read a whole lot of Astrid Lindgren, and it's Fredrik Backman with My Grandmother Asked Me to Tell You She's Sorry. Fredrik Backman, of course, has become one of the authors I feel like I'm going to read everything from. The reason I chose this novel is because I read Britt Marie Was Here, and she is also a huge part of this story, and I felt like I had to see what she was like in this one. In this story we meet Elsa, who is a different 7-year-old kid who is very intelligent and very straightforward as well. She lives with her mother and stepfather, and in the building where they live, her grandmother and a lot of neighbors also live, including Britt Marie. Elsa isn't always doing that great, and her grandmother makes up this alternative universe and tells her stories from this world where everyone's different. And when the grandmother dies, Elsa gets a whole bunch of letters that she is going to distribute, and in the letters it just says that the grandmother says sorry for the things she has done. And the rest of the story is a huge bunch of events happening both in the parallel universe and in the real world. First of all, I have to say that I was a bit caught off guard because I did not know that this was going to be a fantasy novel, so I was a bit surprised. Or very surprised, I should say. I didn't especially like the start of this novel, but with his other novels as well, you kinda don't like the characters until there has passed some time, and I thought after a while I will probably like them more, but I didn't especially like them more after a time had passed. Somewhat more, but not to the degree that I would have liked to. The 7-year-old is funny, and the dialogue between her and the grown-ups can be funny. It just was a bit too much for me at times. It was very unrealistic, and of course it ended up being a fantasy novel, so the unrealistic part is a part of it. Especially when I've read Britt Marie. Britt Marie was a down-to-earth story about a woman that had gone through a lot of very realistic events that grown-ups go through. And going from that book to this one, which is at times very spaced out, I struggled to really reset my head, I think. This might be one of the books where it would have been a good thing if I'd read more about it before I started. But anyway, I really enjoy his down-to-earth writing style, and he is very funny, and the characters are good, but not as good in this one as I thought they were in the other ones. And at times I thought this book was a bit too chaotic, and I felt like I wasn't really following the story 100%. And going from that one to the book that was probably my favorite read of May, it's Haruki Murakami's What I Talk About When I Talk About Running, his memoir. And it's basically about running, writing, and running a jazz cafe. And the preface for this book is written by Frode Gritten, where he writes about our expectations for people that writes books. And I thought that that was a great way of getting into this book, because I at least picture many famous writers as drunken people that are lonesome and without friends, or just enjoying life to the max and maybe sometimes too much. But Haruki Murakami is obviously not that person. He runs, he thinks about what he eats, and he is very focused on the task at hand. Whether it's writing or running. And I absolutely love this book. It was funny. He writes about his own faults in the way he writes and runs, in the way he lives his life. He talks about that probably not a lot of people like him in a very funny way. The language is of course excellent, as you might have thought it would be. This is in no way a self-help book. He writes about his thoughts, and probably without any thought of trying to help anyone to do the same, because that would almost be weird, especially in how he describes sometimes being the person that he is. His life lessons might be summed up to do what you gotta do and concentrate. It's written in this diary form from 2005 to 2007, and I really like how this book progresses and how you can follow his development in thinking about this novel as well. I think the topic of running is quite interesting, because it's so easy to mock the people that chooses to run 42 kilometers, because it feels kinda insane to many people. But I think if you read this book, you might have a better understanding of why people choose to do it, and why people like to do it and even love it. Summed up, this is an honest, funny, and well-written memoir about Murakami's life, including running. Over to this month's biggest surprise, and it's The Bookseller in Kabul by Åsne Seierstad. She is a Norwegian journalist and writer, and this came out in 2002. It's written as an observational interview, if that's the term also in English. And she basically lived with this family in Kabul for some months and wrote about the things she heard there and the intrigues in the family. First of all, I listened to this novel, but I'd already bought it many years ago because I thought one day I'd read it. It made a lot of stir in the Norwegian public when it came out, and also quite a few years afterwards, because the author was sued for portraying the people in the book in a wrongly fashioned manner. And unfortunately, with the situation in Afghanistan, this is also reactualized, so that's why I maybe chose to read it this time around. On the front cover here it says a family drama, and it really was, but it was even more thrilling than I thought it would be. The man in the family changes wives, and people die around him. People are expelled from the family, if that's the right term, and there wasn't really a dull moment throughout this book. It's about 300 pages, so it's not the longest book, but I thought this would be more boring than it was. What I especially enjoyed about this novel is how much historical context you got. You follow this man, especially the bookseller, and his journeys to other countries, negotiating deals for printing books, which books he could print, when he could print them, and which types of books he could have in his store, etc, etc. And it was really interesting. But my favorite thing about reading this novel is how she described people thinking about the regimes changing from day to day, and how the different people reacted to the change of regime. Because at one time you couldn't wear this or that, but suddenly you can, but people might not want to do that at all without maybe having a proper reason for it, but at the same time just being afraid of what could happen again. So you might just be stuck in the old pattern because you're afraid that one day they'll come back and they'll punish you for not following the rules in between the regime change. if that made sense. Maybe a better way of describing it is that change doesn't always lead to change. At least in the way she described it, it did not feel like it. How much of this book is true and might have happened, we don't know, but I would assume that most of the things in the book are real, and it is of course supposed to be. So a really powerful novel about the middle class family in Kabul in the early 2000s. Really enjoyed it. Really enjoyed it. The next book in this wrap-up is said to have been the most significant book in Patti Smith's life, and that's why I'm breaking in my Patti Smith t-shirt today. When thinking about it, I do not know if this is Patti Smith, but I bought it at one of her concerts like 6 or 7 years ago, so I really hope it is. And that's Astragal by Albertine Sarrazin. And this is one of the first books I bought when I started this channel. Basically just because it was one of the favorite books of Patti Smith and I thought I had to read it. This is said to be somewhat based on the author's own life. We meet the main character when she tries to escape prison, and she does, but she also breaks her leg. She is picked up by this man and they run away together. Throughout the novel, she and this man stays at different hiding places in Paris and in France. So this book was kind of disappointing. They run from prison and of course the goal is to not be caught, but I still felt that it lacked direction. It was very much she being locked up in different places without actually having something to do or very little to do while the leg was healing. And basically I felt like that was the whole book. This being a jailbreak novel, I always thought that it would feel like she was on the run and she was nearly getting caught and there were a lot of excitement, but there wasn't at any time. The language in this book certainly would have been more direct than in other books. It was published first in 1965, so I would assume that talking about prostitution in the way that this book does, or the female body for example, would have been outrageous for many people, and maybe why Patti Smith loved this book so much, who knows. But the story in itself I found very boring, and yeah, I'm just happy that it's not in the non-read shelf since it's been there for such a long time. But it is a cult classic without me understanding anything about that. I do not understand why people like this. So I'm very happy with this month's reads. I feel like now we're halfway there in the shelf. 4 shelves has been filled up and 4 is left to go before I can buy a new shelf. So that feels great. For every month that passes, I feel like I'm closer to knowing what types of books I really enjoy, and it makes it easier to decide which books I'm going to read next, which is a very good thing about this process. Have you read any of these books, or do you have recommendations for which books I could try out next? Please comment below. And there will be links to these books as always in the description if you want to check any of these out. If you're not subscribed to this channel, please subscribe if you like these videos, and I'll see you next time. Thank you for watching. Bye!